Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 48, the city of the great king. We have the superscription, very short this time, a song, a psalm of the sons of Korah. No surprises there. And now the psalm itself begins, Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised. Remember when you see the Lord in all capital letters, that's the name of God, Yahweh. But our translation, and indeed most English translations, take that and render it Lord instead of using the divine name out of respect, I think. They replace it with the word Lord in all capital letters. This is a tradition, I should say, that goes all the way back to the Septuagint. They really did the same thing. Didn't do it in all capital letters, but it replaced the divine name with the Greek word kurios, which just means Lord. So we have that same tradition here. Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised. Notice how the opening line has its focus on the Lord. Next, we're going to talk about the city of the Lord. But then when we get to the very end of the psalm, the very last verse is again going to be a focus on the Lord. But in between, we're going to talk about the city of God. And that's introduced now. The rest of verse 1, in the city of our God, his holy mountain. Now, the city of our God, we immediately think of the city of Jerusalem. And that's supposed to be in view, although I think by the time we get to the end of this chapter, we're going to see something beyond just the physical city in the Middle East, Jerusalem. But for the time being, it's okay to think about that, the city of Jerusalem, the city of our God. Notice his holy mountain. What had made it the holy mountain had been that David had captured the city, this Canaanite city. He had made it the capital, and he had brought the Ark of the Covenant here. And then later on, after David's death, his son Solomon built the temple here, and that could now house the Ark of the Covenant. And now it was set apart to God. That's what makes it his holy mountain. Although I would suggest there was some foreshadowing of this going all the way back to the days of Abraham. Remember how Abraham took his son Isaac, according to the command of God, to be sacrificed. Now, God stopped the sacrifice from taking place, but still, he told Abraham to go to the land of Moriah. And if you look at the Temple Mount, that you're seeing a picture of it here, with the most visible part you can see is the Dome of the Rock, which stands uh, where the temple originally stood. I think my own opinion is that it's exactly on the same spot. Now, some people say, well, it was a little bit to the north, a little bit to the south, but that is the Temple Mount. I think it's exactly on that location. That was the highest point of the Temple Mount, and that's where you would have put the temple. And it was that same place, the land of Moriah. Now, Genesis chapter 22 doesn't say it was on Mount Moriah, but tradition has it that it was on the exact same spot, and I think that works. I won't say dogmatically that's the same location, but I think it works nicely. It ties it all in to make it his holy mountain. Notice we continue, beautiful in elevation. The joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion. Now, Mount Zion, Har Zion, uh, that's just the Hebrew word for mountain is Har. Like later on, you're going to see Har Megiddo, or we say Armageddon, Mount of Megiddo. This is Mount Zion, Har Zion, and that term is initially referred to the ancient Canaanite city that David captured. In fact, the first time you see the word Zion is in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 7, as David goes up to capture that city from the Canaanites and to make it his new capital city. It came eventually to refer to the place where the temple was located. Now, the temple wasn't located in the original Canaanite city. That Canaanite city was just along the ridge that extends south of what we call today the Temple Mount. But Solomon eventually extended that and placed the temple on the high point to the north of the city. And this describes the place where God rules. And the term Zion, or I'm going to say Zion, the English pronunciation, that's going to be used more generally to speak of the place where God is. He's in the temple. It's his abiding place, his holy place. And it can refer to both the earthly temple and maybe something beyond that. But we're going to look at that in a minute. Notice, is that beautiful in elevation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion. But notice the next line, in the far north. And that's interesting because the temple isn't in the far north. In fact, it's just a little bit, less than a mile north of the old Canaanite city. So it's not in the far north of Israel. And that's an interesting idea. So Jerusalem isn't located in the north part of the land. It's actually sort of centrally located if anything, maybe a little bit to the south, but it's centrally located right between the kingdom of Judah, what would eventually be the kingdom of Judah, and the northern kingdom of Israel, when the kingdom of Israel split into two parts. But that's a different discussion. But notice Mount Zion is being described as that place in the far north. And so I would suggest this is symbolic language. This isn't to be taken rigidly literal. It's a figure of speech. Isaiah chapter 14 and verse 13. These are the words of the king of Babylon. He's speaking rather boastfully. In fact, the old medieval interpretation of this passage was that this was Satan. You have the term Lucifer used by Jerome. He didn't mean to refer to that as Satan. That was what they called the planet Venus back in his day. And that led to that medieval interpretation, which is still very popular today. But that's another topic too. The king of Babylon says in Isaiah 14:13, "I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses," there it is, "in the recesses of the north." Again, figurative language for this place of exaltation, and Mount Zion is exalted by God. Notice it's described the city of the great king. And so we have that exaltation of Jerusalem because God made his presence known here, because he had his temple built here. It becomes the center of the world. In fact, there's a place, if I remember correctly, it was over in Ezekiel, that described Jerusalem as being in the, notice I said center. The Hebrew word actually has the word for navel, your belly button, your navel, that it was in the navel of the world, centrally located in that sense, but also in the far north, that is exalted. We continue with verse 3, God in her palaces. Now, her refers back to the city. Remember that all words in Hebrew are either masculine or feminine. There's no way to say it in Hebrew. There's no neuter in Hebrew. And the term ear for city is feminine. So God in her palaces, that is the palaces of Jerusalem, has made himself known as a stronghold. Next, we see the attitude of the pagan kings, and that's what we have in verse 4. "For lo, the kings assembled themselves." These aren't the godly kings. These aren't the kings of Judah. But rather these are the outsider kings. "For lo, the kings assembled themselves. They passed by together. They saw it, then they were amazed. They were terrified. They fled in alarm. Panic seized them there. Anguish as of a woman in childbirth." Now, throughout most of Israel's history and throughout most of Jerusalem's history, you didn't have people, the pagan nations weren't in all of this terror and fear and alarm of the city of Jerusalem. Because if you look at Jerusalem compared to all the other nations of the ancient world, Jerusalem was sort of can I say it? And I'm not trying to be mean, it was sort of a backward city, way up there in the mountains. It wasn't like the city of Babylon or the city of Nineveh or even the city of Memphis in Egypt. It was a lot smaller. But there have been times, and I'm not saying this is what it applies to, but I can't help but think of that time where the great Assyrian conqueror Sennacherib came up against Jerusalem. And he assembled his armies against the city of Jerusalem. And then God showed up, and overnight, 185,000 Assyrians just dropped dead. And so, now I'm not saying that that's what this refers to, but that would fit if it did. And so, is this prophetic? Is this symbolic? Or is this maybe very real? Because this did have an actual literal fulfillment, and at least in that instance, if not in others as well. We continue into verse 7. With the east wind, you break the ships of Tarshish. Now, Tarshish was almost like a mystical land. It was a real place, but it was as far as you could go in the ancient world and still be in the world. It was way outside of the land. We think it usually refers to, remember how Jonah gets on a ship that's headed for Tarshish. It's not to Never Never Land, but we think it's probably referring to the uttermost part of the area in the Mediterranean. That is what we would look at as Spain. If you're in Israel and you go as far as you can go to the west, you're going to get to Tarshish. I guess if you go to the east, you're going to get to some other lands in the east. But Tarshish, notice, with the east wind, you break the ships of Tarshish. Ships of Tarshish, that's on the other side of the Mediterranean. And remember, to the Jews, that was like going into outer space, because Jews, as a rule, did not get into ships and sail. The Jews had no navy. When you see Solomon build a fleet of ships at Eilat down on the Red Sea, he doesn't do that himself. He doesn't sail them. He probably hires Phoenicians to do both the building and the sailing. And by the way, that fleet doesn't do very well long term. But notice, with the east wind, you break the ships of Tarshish. That is, God is not just a local God of the hills of Judea, or Judah. He's the God of all creation, even to the furthest reaches of the known world. Verse 8, as we have heard, so we have seen. And so notice that's speaking of the ends of the earth, and God's power is everywhere. That was the point that we saw in verse 7. Now, so we have seen in the city of the Lord of hosts, in the city of our God, God will establish her forever. We continue into verse 9. We have thought on your loving kindness. Now, God is being addressed here. So up to this point, we've been speaking largely about God, but now we focus on addressing God himself. We have thought on and there's that term, loving kindness. That's our old friend chesed. And I like the translation, loving kindness is okay, but that's sort of a big word, and this is a very tiny word. So I actually like loyalty. I think that works nicely, and it captures the idea. If you're showing loving kindness, you're showing loyalty, and vice versa. But I think loyalty captures the bigger idea of this term, like a covenant loyalty. And we have thought on your loyalty, O God, your loving kindness. That is, God has been loyal to his people. Notice, in the midst of your temple, as is your name, O God, so is your praise to the ends of the earth. Now, notice verse 10. As is your name, and then it says, "Oh God," although God, that's the term Elohim, that's not his name. That's what he is. He is God. His name, though, is the covenant name that we've seen earlier in this chapter. When we talked about the Lord in all capital letters, we would say Yahweh, or some translations will say Jehovah, and depending on what what pronunciation you're using, that's how you go. That's okay. But as is your name, O God, so is your praise to the ends of the earth. That is, his name reflects that covenant loyalty and is worthy of the praise that goes to all places. Next, your right hand is full of righteousness. Let Mount Zion be glad. Let the daughters of Judah rejoice because of your judgments. And now we have an instruction. Walk about Zion and go around her. Count her towers. And Zion now is going to be pictured as a portrait of that covenant faithfulness, of God's loyalty, of God's faithfulness. And so walk about, count her towers, consider her ramparts, go through her palaces, that you may tell it to the next generation. As you look at Jerusalem, Jerusalem is a living reminder of God's faithfulness. Think about the times that God's people would would be in the land, and God would do something, and then he would say, now set up a memorial, maybe a standing stone. I think of Jacob, who has this dream that God gives him of a ladder stretching to heaven, and he sets up a stone there and calls the place Bethel, house of God, but he sets up a memorial stone. Later on, Joshua comes to the land, and what do? They set up memorial stones. And God says, I have set up a memorial stone. It's the city of Jerusalem. And so go through her, and I think it's a good thing to go and visit Jerusalem. Count her towers, consider her ramparts, go through her palaces, that you may tell it to the next generation that God is faithful and he has done great things in this place, as well as what it represents. We continue into verse 14. For such is God, our God, forever and ever. He will guide us until death. And so we started off with a focus on the Lord. We come now, after having had this tour of the city of Jerusalem, the reminders that were there, but we come at the end to focus again on the Lord. Don't miss the Lord in your seeing Jerusalem. You see, if you just look at Jerusalem without focusing on the Lord, you've missed the big idea, because Jerusalem is to be a mirror, a reflection, is to turn your attention to the faithfulness of God. Now, when he says he will guide us until death, that presupposes that they will be guided by the Lord. In a sense, this is, can I say this? This is conditioned on their being guided by the Lord. And I can't help but think of how Jesus came to Jerusalem and took in that same view that we just looked at a minute ago, standing on the Mount of Olives and looking over Jerusalem. And he called out, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who were sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. You see, Jerusalem was destroyed because of the unfaithfulness of those who lived in her. It happened once back in the Old Testament, what we think of as the Babylonian captivity, where Jerusalem was destroyed by Babylon, by Nebuchadnezzar, and the temple was destroyed. But then God, in his faithfulness, brought his people back, and they rebuilt the temple. And again, when he sent his Messiah, his only begotten Son, and they rejected him. Notice how the words of Jesus in verse 38, behold, your house is being left to you desolate. Those words were fulfilled. Those words took place. Where Jerusalem was destroyed a second time, the temple this time was destroyed and has not yet been rebuilt. Now, will it be rebuilt again? That's another conversation. But as we come to Revelation chapter 21, there's a promise of a new Jerusalem, where he says, I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. That's going to take place, in a sense, that's taking place right now as the Lord, before he sent it into heaven, said, lo, I am with you, not I will be with you, I am with you always. And if you are trusting in him, you are part, not just in the future, you are part right now of a heavenly city, a heavenly Jerusalem.